Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming to help us to celebrate in this wonderful way the 50th anniversary of the Center and to hear Professor Swearer give his lecture this evening. So it's been a grand occasion for all of us, and I'm very honored and happy to be able to say a few words now introducing Don on this very great occasion. Great festivities and conversations have filled the past 2 days. At lunch yesterday, and today too, we have heard many reminiscences about the Center's first 50 years from those who lived and studied and taught here at various times. Lee Schmidt's opening address and today's panels have enabled us to reflect on the heritage, the current work, and some possible future directions for the Center. We have much to think about, and I'm relieved that before I give some opening reflections at an event in the fall, I will have the summer to reread and think about all that I've heard today. I also believe firmly that all the challenges that were put forward, Don will take care of by the end of June and leave me free. He has 2.5 months, come on. We can see very clearly during this 50th anniversary year how the Center is an evolving entity that, like our various faith traditions, has changed over time, adapting itself to new possibilities and needs. As the leader and catalyst of activity, each of the directors of the Center has brought forward his own gifts appropriate to the time. I never met Robert Slater, who was there at the beginning, but his son Peter has given me great insights into his father's life and work. I met Wilfred Cantwell Smith only a few times and hardly knew him as well as many of you did. But we heard about him already yesterday, and we'll be hearing more about him in a few minutes. And as was acknowledged earlier, we're very lucky today to have in our presence two of the former directors, John Carman and Larry Sullivan, and we're grateful that they're here with us. It is particularly appropriate then to bring our celebration and reflection on the Center, past, present, and future, to a close with the words of Donald Swearer, distinguished visiting professor of Buddhist studies and director of the Center since 2004. We all know Don well, and from very different moments in his career at Swarthmore and here, and so he requires no general introduction. But I think it is appropriate for us to reflect for a moment on the extraordinary gifts and interest he has brought to the Center as its 5th director. Don is, of course, a committed teacher, and perhaps everything begins there. For over 30 years, Don taught at Swarthmore and was beloved there by several generations of students. He brought here with him to Harvard a love of teaching, a commitment to collegial work and conversation, such as are necessary to teaching if it is to flourish as a community of learning and not simply the virtuoso work of this or that individual. Despite the duties and demands on his time as director, Don has continued in his years at Harvard to be clearly committed to teaching, both at HDS itself and in the college, right down to the 2 courses he's given this year, one in the fall, Buddhist Christian Encounters, a course that was very practically tied in with the Parliament of Religions in Australia, and in this current semester, the Buddha in Myth, Image, and Ritual, a course that draws deeply and specifically on his lifelong scholarship. Indeed, this latter course on the Buddha in Myth, Image, and Ritual has drawn on Don's expertise as a scholar, and that expertise has for these 6 years provided the necessary grounding for his work as director. For as we all know, Don is a highly respected expert in the Buddhist traditions of Thailand, and many of his recent scholarly books show this professional expertise, including those that more or less coincide with his time at Harvard. 2004, Sacred Mountains of Northern Thailand and Their Legends. 2009, The Buddhist World in Southeast Asia. 2004 again, a very beautiful book that brings together theory, theology, practice, the imagery, the lived experience, Becoming the Buddha, the ritual of image consecration in Thailand. Such books nicely bring together technical academic scholarship, a sense of history and tradition, and yet to engage in contemporary matters of concern to us all. That Don, as a scholar, has had this very contemporary interest has also been important to his time as director here at the Center. In a way that is not the case for all, or perhaps even for most scholars, Don has managed over the years to balance his expertise, his commitment to solid scholarship, with a consistent commitment to problems that remain urgent today, ranging from issues in the world of business, to the challenges of human rights in today's society, to ecology and the environment. Again, this was manifest in his work before coming to Harvard in books such as 1990, Ethics, Wealth, and Salvation, a study in Buddhist social ethics, or 1997, Buddhist Perspectives on the Earth Charter. This commitment to the contemporary and ethical relevance of religion and the study of religion has continued very much during Don's years here at Harvard, with thematic projects in books such as these, 2006, with David Little, Religion and Nationalism in Iraq, A Comparative Perspective, 2009, Ecology and the Environment, and by analogy and extension, the still more recent books related to the series that the Center has hosted under Don's leadership, just out very recently, Rethinking the Human, and coming out very soon, Ecologies of Human Flourishing. And finally, it is also good to remember how Don has also nurtured the vision that CSWR is a true center, a calm space of centering, whereas in the many strands of research, teaching, and conversation at HDS and around the university come together. The vitality of conversations nurtured by Don in the space of the center has been very evident in the thematic series that have occurred each year, but also in the center's generous support of faculty research by faculty fellowships and by instituting a new set of senior visiting fellowships for visitors who would come from around the world to join our faculty and teach with our own professors. For instance, John Sokol came from the Czech Republic and taught with Ron Thiemann. Andrew Iganoza came from Nigeria to teach with Jacob Alupana. Professor Vasanta Rao came from Andhra in India to teach with John Carman. And right now, Amarakirti Leonaje is here teaching with Charlie Hallisey, come from Sri Lanka. In-house at the center itself, the World Religions Cafes on Wednesday evenings have been notable successes, bringing together residents at the center and their friends for conversation on works in progress, a rich display of interest ranging this year, from the ones I heard, lamentation in the New Testament, to student-initiated follow-ups on the Parliament of Religions in Australia, and a wonderful recent talk by Professor Bahulkar, Food in the Indian Traditions. As director, Don has also managed to foster a still wider and worldwide set of connections that keep vital the original purposes of the center. The Greeley Summer Intern Program for students has placed students, first of all, at the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Peace at Payap University in Chiang Mai in Thailand, and also at the Henry Martin Institute, International Center for Research, Interfaith Relations, and Reconciliation in Hyderabad in India. Don has also fostered good relations with Sarvodaya in Sri Lanka and the Center for Religious Tolerance at Dankook University in Korea. In a moment, we will hear Don speak to us on a world theology, Wilfred Cantwell Smith and the Center for the Study of World Religions. This address will bring to the fore still timely theological issues that are urgent even now, and yet are also in keeping with Don's long-term theological and dialogical interests that have flourished throughout his career in this country and also in his many, many visits and times of living in Thailand. I must admit that, indeed, it was Don's 1989 book with Patrick Henry, For the Sake of the World, The Spirit of Buddhist and Christian Monasticism, that was my first time to encounter his work and to begin to wish that I had met this man. And it came true. It's a wonderful book still 20 years later. Before turning things over to Don, the moment we're all waiting for, it's well to remember that after this event, there will be two more final moments that illumine, I think, in a very special way, the meaning of Don's years as director. First, we'll proceed to the Brown Room for the ceremonial dismantling of the Tibetan sand mandala that Loseng Samten has made, and the procession to the center courtyard for the dissolution in the fountain in the courtyard. This, in a way, I think, is very evocative because it reminds us, in a very basic way, of the impermanent and flexible boundary between thinking about religion and thinking and acting in religious ways. It also confronts us, more basically still, with the fact that even as we engage as a professor, as a student, as a friend, as a teacher, in our best and most elaborate constructions of reality, at some point we need to let go. We need to allow things to come apart beyond our control. But second, even after the dissolution of the mandala, there will be a reception at the center, again welcoming us into what has been for 6 years home for Don and Nancy, And they are once again, as they have done many times in the past 6 years, welcoming us into their home to celebrate memories and friendships. For this, we have to be continually grateful to Don and Nancy, especially tonight. But I've said enough, so let us now welcome Don and hear his address.
Frank, I thought you were going to put some water down here for me to walk on as I came to the... It is commonplace for speakers to refer to that generous introduction. This was an overly generous introduction, but I'm grateful. Thank you very much. And I'm thrilled that Frank is going to be the new director of the center, and I look forward to following his career over the next 50 years of the center's life. I did want to make just one comment about the 6 years that Nancy and I have had at the center. It has been a marvelous time when Bill Graham called us in Thailand and invited me to come here as the director, and we visited a couple of times and thought this would be a rather interesting post-retirement job. It's been thrilling for us, something that we have very, very much enjoyed. It's been very challenging, at times a bit overly exhausting, but it has been a great time. What has happened over the past 6 years, which Frank very generously attributed to my leadership, could never have happened without the marvelous staff that I've worked with. So I wonder if they would stand up. I think they're all here. And Joe, come on, stand up. Where is Charles? Is he? And the only further comment I wanted to make that is, since I've acknowledged you, all of you, and Joe, that if you would just quit saying you're a lame duck, quack, quack. You have your reward. This talk is not about Wilfred Cantwell Smith as such. That indeed would be a very interesting talk. There are people here in the audience who could do it much better than I. What are the influences on Wilfred's life and in the development of his thought in India? Was his concept of transcendence, which was so central to his thinking, influenced by his work in Islam? How do we look at Wilfred in relationship both to his contemporaries in the field and also to his critics, of which he has a fair number? But I'm not going to deal with that. I'm really not qualified to do that. The invited speaker at my senior class commencement banquet over 50 years ago was the actor Jimmy Stewart. He opened his informal remarks with the quip, "I'm here to make a pitch for the movie industry." So in a somewhat oblique way, my talk this afternoon, focusing on Wilfred Cantwell Smith, CSWR director from 1964 to 1973, is an unabashed pitch. Not for the movie industry, but for Wilfred and the CSWR. Now I should say, should there be any question, I want to add that Jimmy Stewart's role in the classic award-winning film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, bears no analogical relationship to the upcoming Father Clooney Goes to the CSWR. Few historians of religion in America are as well-known and controversial as Wilfred Cantwell Smith. Although his sometimes contentious reputation wasn't mentioned in his February 2000 obituary that lauded him as one of the past century's most influential contributors to interfaith dialogue and the comparative study of religion. When I began teaching my teaching career at Oberlin College in the mid-60s, Wilfred and Mircea Eliade bookended religious studies for me. Although their approaches to religion were in many respects a picture in contrasts, encapsulated by the nomenclature of history of religions versus the history of religion, hermeneutics and patterns versus historical diversity, faith, and transcendence, both of them brought to the field of religious studies a deep moral commitment that, I think, in the language of their contemporary Paul Tillich, expressed their ultimate concern. In inaugurating the journal History of Religions, for instance, Eliade made the following observations. The comparative study of religions is destined to assume a cultural role of first importance, not only because an understanding of exotic and archaic religions will significantly assist in a cultural dialogue with the representatives of such religion, it's more especially because by attempting to understand the existential situations expressed by the documents he is studying, the historian of religions will inevitably attain a deeper knowledge of what it means to be human. It's on the basis of such knowledge, said Eliade, that a new humanism on a worldwide scale could develop. Now, I think Wilfred might quibble with the meaning of representatives of other religions and humanism, but he would, I think, be very sympathetic to the language of existential situation and a deeper knowledge of what it means to be human. For Wilfred viewed religion, or more specifically faith, in terms of the matrix of the existential encounter among persons and as an essential quality of what it means to be human. As a critic, Smith attacked contemporary philosophical discussions of religious language for failing to reckon with its religious and historical quality within a comparative context, for failing to treat religious statements as essentially human and personal, and for a lack of sensitivity to the profound, yes, elusive and complex quality of human life. In like manner, he took on historians of religion cum phenomenologists for addressing religious objects and patterns, but not the persons related to them, even though, as we shall see later, Smith did use the terminology patterns. Smith's criticisms continue to be refined and elaborated in his many publications subsequent to the appearance of his seminal and probably best-known monograph that has been referred to in our panels, The Meaning and End of Religion, that was published in 1962. Smith has been controversial in part because he chose to be contentious. And he was contentious because he thought that many professionals in the field of religion treated it as a system, an ism, a simplistic, sterile, overly conceptualized, static entity which has little to do with the personal and historic quality that we label religion. In other words, those of us who teach religions do not really teach religion. Rather, we teach a text, a methodology, the sociology of religion, the philosophy of religion, and so on, that is far removed from the mystery and the manure of real-life persons trying to make sense of a world that is often boring and meaningless, and frequently, in times like our own, seemingly on the verge of falling apart at the seams. Smith's controversial personalism upheld the view that religious truth does not lie in religious systems, but in persons, a point to which I'll return later. My remarks this afternoon will focus primarily on a constructive or a normative, and I want to be very frank about this, rather than a critical interpretation of Smith's 1981 monograph, Towards a World Theology. And I'll conclude with a much briefer, almost coda reflection about the CSWR in the light of some of the themes in Smith's approach to religion and religious studies. Towards a World Theology captured my attention over 25 years ago. I was gratified to learn fairly recently that Kenneth Cracknell's 2001 anthology of Wilfred's work entitled Wilfred Cantwell Smith, A Reader, confirmed the significance of Towards a World Theology among the many works in the Smith oeuvre. In Cracknell's view, Towards a World Theology offers both an overview and a recapitulation of Smith's main concerns. He includes 5 selections from Towards a World Theology in 4 of his anthology's 7 divisions. Smith as a comparativist, as a critic, as a theologian, and a prophet. Cracknell and many others highlight the categories of faith and transcendence as the 2 major themes in Smith's thought. Now, while I don't agree with this analysis, I find the categories of person, community, and what may surprise some of you who are readers of Smith, imagination, equally, if not more significant, especially in considering Smith's relevance for the legacy of the CSWR. In Towards a World Theology, Smith tilts at the windmills of the academic study of religion on an even grander scale than in some of his earlier writings. Have we not really subjected our teaching, if not our understanding of religion, to the epistemology of the natural sciences, he asks, which locates the truth in objects, which claims that the truth can be manipulated, tested, repeated, verified empirically, and so on? What kind of truth is that? Is it religious truth? Surely not. Religious truth, truth in the most profound sense, truth that emerges from the intersecting moments of our mundanity and transmundanity, cannot be so quantified. Truth in this sense, says Smith, is fundamentally personal. It involves a knower, not simply the human context in which a person knows, and an object that is known. Knowing the truth, then, is not a question of subjective versus objective or internal states of mind versus external objects, but an organically whole, we might even call it an act of truth. It is, in Smith's terms, a critical, rational, inductive self-consciousness by which a community of persons is aware of any given particular condition, human condition or action, as a condition or action of itself as a community, and is aware of it as it is experienced and understood simultaneously, both subjectively, personally, existentially, and objectively, externally, critically, analytically. To know the moon from the standpoint of humane studies, Smith argues, would include a knowledge of the role of the moon in human life and in the history of human culture and poetry and religion and love, as well as the natural sciences, technology, and space travel. Or to understand the Meenakshi temple in Madurai would not only involve dates, sizes, and compositions, but how it feels to be a worshiper within it, its significance in the lives of the shopkeepers, in its environment, and its role in the city. Knowing the truth in this sense is an art. It's an art requiring a whole series of human qualities, including faith, which for Smith is fundamentally a quality of being a person. In practical terms, it involves a community of both practitioners and scholars. To know another, contends Smith, we must be able to live and think imaginatively, to stand in that human situation, realizing there is no person on earth I can fully understand, and yet no person I cannot understand at all. Humane knowledge, in this sense, is integrative of the person and the community, in contrast to objective knowledge that presumes separation and leads to fragmentation. Objective knowledge stresses method and inherently implies that what is known is both dominant and dominated. By way of contrast, humane learning involves being open to a greater than oneself, which Smith labels transcendence. It's a process of becoming, not simply knowing. In Towards a World Theology, Smith is not saying that those who teach religion should not be rational or rigorous or any of those qualities that we associate with being objective and descriptive rather than normative and subjective. He's saying, however, that such a posture jeopardizes not only the kind of learning that ought to take place in the academy, but the very nature of religious truth itself, which is multivalent and multiplex. It's a four-dimensional crossroads kind of truth which we at the center extend, where we at the center extend our critical self-understanding into the breadth of the human community, the depth of our personal awareness, and the extended reach of our transcendence, an insight which is at one and the same time timely and timeless, historical and transcendent. Smith is not asking academics who teach religion to be persons of faith, although his own understanding depends very much on the fact that he is a person of faith. Nor is he asking that those of us who teach religion to do religion, but he is, by his own terms, asking us to teach not only religious traditions or cumulative tradition, as he characterizes it, but faith, with all that that implies, both for the pedagogy and the epistemology of this enterprise. We might say that Smith calls on us to teach religion with sufficient background and training in the history, languages, and cultures of a religious tradition so that any living person at any existential moment is understood to mirror a world that is at one and the same time particular and universal, a unique individual who is also part of a much larger diachronic and synchronic framework and whose personal story is seen as part of a cosmic story, both human and divine. Smith calls on professionals in the field to become a part of that story, to enter imaginatively into what it means to be a particular Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, and Jew, rather than teaching the isms and the ologies. His point might, I think, be seen in dialectical terms. He asks us to move between the particular and the generic. Between the particular and the generic. This is, I think, the very foundation of what Smith means by a world theology. Or perhaps it would be more apt to say dynamic, interactive process that gives shape to a world theology. He's convinced that we can teach faith, salvation, sacraments generically. Or perhaps it might be more accurate to say from a generic perspective, that the challenges of teaching sacraments, for example, within the context of world religion is really no different in kind than teaching it within a particular tradition. Let me illustrate what I understand to be Smith's point here by referring to his discussion of Buddhists, not Buddhism, Buddhists, in his 1965 book, The Faith of Other Men, originally delivered as radio talks over the national network of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, revised then and republished in 1998 under the title Patterns of Faith Around the World. Those of you who are familiar with this slim volume will recognize or recall that Smith organizes his discussion of each community of religious persons around a single symbol, in the hope, he says, that through it we may gain insight into the religious life of those for whom it is meaningful. For Buddhists, then, he chose the Shinbyu, the Burmese Novitiate ordination ceremony. He begins the chapter with a description of the physical space in which the ceremony takes place. A temple in a village setting, sufficiently demarcated to symbolize its sanctity, set apart, but near enough to be relevant and concerned and involved in everyday issues and problems. Between the recognized norms, says Smith, and the actuality of everyday life, between the abiding and the transient, the sacred and the profane, the relation is very close. yet the two are not entirely identical. Smith then situates, having done that kind of descriptive task, Smith then situates the Shinbyu comparatively within the framework of a rite de passage. He says, in the broad sweep, it compares to joining the church, or a first communion or confirmation in the Christian pattern, or the bar mitzvah in the Jewish, and to related ceremonies in other world religions. He then turns to a description of the ritual as a reenactment of the going forth or great renunciation of Siddhartha Gautama, the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, that he then characterizes in general terms, having moved from the descriptive, to a spiritual quest to seek out a remedy for humanity's ills. This, in a sense, is a sort of Joseph Campbell-like move, but we need to keep in mind how he came to this point. That is, he came to this point through the descriptive and through the particular before making this kind of a generic or a general claim. Like the comparable rites of passage to which Smith refers, a village Shinbyu is a major gala event for the families whose male children are being ordained, for an event for the entire village as well. So I am now going to look at not a Shinbyu, but a comparable ritual in northern Thailand. If we could possibly have the lights down just a little bit now. I'm going to sort of think about this the way I think Smith might think about it. This is in a village in Lamphun province, which is very near Chiang Mai, where Nancy and I do live when we go to Thailand and do research. This is the porch of the local wat, or temple, or monastery in the village. And there's a lot of village youth here. The ones that are going through this ritual are dressed in white, and then they have some makeup on. So I think Smith might ask, if we look at this and try to sort of make sense out of the bodies, out of the dress, how are we going to understand the white? And he, I think, might put this within a general pattern of a rite of passage, that white has something to symbolize, it has something to do with a kind of ritual liminality that this event represents. The young boys who wore a particular dress, who had a particular role in the village, are now going to enter into a new phase of their life as an ordained novice monk. And so this kind of liminality, this betwixt and the between, to use this kind of language, is in a sense without clear demarcations, it's without clear markers. Would be one way of symbolizing it. We might try to tease out some more meanings. We might say white and purity and so forth, but I think in terms of the pattern of a rite of passage, which Smith is talking about, I think it would be more this kind of notion of liminality, of betwixt and betweenness. But what about the makeup? What's going on here? Smith would look at this, or if I ask you, what's happening here? I mean, why are they're going to be ordained as monks? Why are they getting all dressed up in this fancy stuff? Again, going back to what I just referred to in Smith's interpretation, is this not a mimetic reenactment of Siddhartha Gautama's going forth? So we have here young Siddharthas, right? Young princes, who again, compressing the time frame of the narrative of the Buddha's enlightenment story, are going through the same sort of process. Now, one of the aspects of Smith's interpretation and study is his insistence that you try to grasp and encounter as many details as possible. So while on the one hand, he might appeal to sort of this general going forth pattern in a kind of Campbellian kind of way, he's going to try to look at as many of these details as possible. So just in terms of this particular photo here, what's going on? I mean, we have the young boy dressed up as a prince with dark glasses. I don't think the Buddha ever wore dark glasses, did he, Anne? I don't think so. Yeah. But what about this stuff? What about this? What about that? What's this got to do with sort of the story, with the grand narrative, with the growing forth? Well, in a sense, it's got nothing to do with it. Because this is all about Ryekwan. It's all about spirit calling. So, in the Buddhist analysis of the person, you are composed of 32 bodily parts and 32 spirit parts. So, if you're going to embark on any kind of worthwhile enterprise, or in this case, this transition, you better get your act together, right? Get your 32 bodily parts and 32 spirit parts together. So there's a sense in which it fits into the rite of passage pattern, but with a degree of cultural detail which we have to include in the study. Now, in the legend of Siddhartha, the prince mounted on his horse. He flew over the walls that surround the capital of Kapilavastu. Well, it's the backs of fathers and uncles that have to sort of substitute in this case. Somewhat inebriated. Oh, but doesn't Buddhism have a prohibition against taking alcohol? So how are we going to sort of fit that together, the sort of normative teaching of the tradition? It's part of the lived tradition, right? And that has to be included. This is a gala occasion. This is a festive occasion. So we include that. And occasionally there's a family that has enough wherewithal to rent a horse from the local racetrack when they, which seems a little incongruous. But and meanwhile, the children are back then in the temple, and their mothers are very kind of anxious as to how they're going to look, so they're going to get them all looking up in the appropriate way. The whole village is there. This is a gala occasion. This is a grand occasion. An expensive occasion, too, relatively speaking. And the person who conducts this part of the ceremony was my old teacher of Northern Thai, not a monk. The monks don't do these sort of spirit calling ceremonies because he's then going to call the spirits, the spirit calling part of the ceremony. Before then, they get, and there's a few slides of the Shinbyu for Charlie's. And there's an interesting gender issue that these slides from a similar ceremony in Mandalay. There's an interesting general issue here because there are girls. You would not find this in Thailand, but this sort of party part of the ordination of the Shinbyu involves girls. And after the party part, after they're dressed up and after they pose and play games and so forth and so on, then the boys will then take the vows of a novice monk, and the girls will have their ears bored. So, a rite of passage. Now, very, very quickly, they then are going, this is another, not the same ceremony, obviously. This is a much older young man who has just graduated from university, and he's going to be ordained temporarily for one's range retreat, or 3 months. So let me just quickly go through these slides. The young boys would take off their clothes, they would have their head shaved, they would then put on the robes of a monk. In this case, this is this young man's teacher, his acharya. He then pays his respect to the abbot of the monastery who's going to conduct the ceremony. He will take the appropriate vows of a monk before his entry then into the monastic life. Okay. You've heard this referred to as God's Motel? Forget it. It's something else. It's a monastery, right? Who better to be the new director than a Jesuit? So after describing the Shinbyu ceremony within the social and physical space in which it takes place, and the normative narrative that the ritual reenacts, Smith then moves beyond these particulars to a generic interpretation. Beyond the forms, there is an intimation of a transcending, limitless truth. Perhaps. This infinite becomes in part available to us through the finite. through those finite channels that a society inherits and cherishes and uses to express its faith and nourish it. Can we learn something about that faith and appreciate in part that inner meaning by exploring the significance of the outward forms? For Smith, the truth to which a religious symbol points can't be fully apprehended by those outside the tradition or those inside the tradition. There's the whole notion of apprehension in terms of truth, and this is where imagination, I think, and my understanding of Smith plays such an important part. Whereas for Smith, the Shinbyu, as religious symbol, points to a transcendent greater than, equally important is the fact that it's situated in a multivalent matrix of diachronic and synchronic meanings that challenge any facile generalization. Interpretation, then, concludes Smith, from his perspective, must be suggestive rather than conclusive. Now, whether or not we're going to refer to this as epistemological humility, it's interesting. This cautionary note doesn't undermine interpretation, but it engenders a degree of hermeneutical humility. A personalist interpretation of the ritual involves what Smith refers to as poetic truth. The going forth myth symbolizes a psychological and spiritual truth of almost universal validity. In reading Towards a World Theology, one is reminded of the priority that Smith assigns to faith as a category of understanding religion. His insistence that religious truth is personal and the connection between the two. Faith, for Wilfred, is much like Martin Buber's, I think, between, that sense of essential connectedness that underlies all apparent me and thems, us and theys, that transforms the objective I-it attitude toward the world into an I-thou attitude, an orientation of the whole personality, an organizing principle by which the person is open to the infinite, in Smith's terms, and is enabled to see that which is finite is in relationship to that infinite meaning, that meaning beyond. A theology of religion, or a world theology, then, I think, for Smith, builds from this premise. Not a premise in a logical deduction, but a premise on which we understand all religious persons to have and to base their lives upon. In reading Toward a World Theology, I then began to understand more clearly what Smith means by converting noun terms for religion, the ities and the isms, into adjectives, what it means to be Muslimly or to be Christianly, because in faith, in the most basic sense of what it means to be a human being, I am the other and the other is me. The theology is in a living, real sense, is not Christian or Muslim or Jewish, but it's a self-theology, which at one and the same time excludes no one. What does such a claim mean? A Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim is not only identified with a particular religious tradition, then, in Smith's view, but with a world history or a world story. At this point, I think Smith becomes a visionary, not in the sense of a vision of a world religion, but of a world community predicated on faith as he understands it. It also means, however, that when Smith, as a faithful person within the Christian community, talks about a theology of comparative religion with special reference to Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, and Buddhist communities, he's not trying to represent Islam as a religious system or to do Hindu or Jewish theology. He is, odd as it may sound, being adjectivally Hindu, Jewish, and Buddhist. Not in the sense of representing each tradition as a system, but as a particular Muslim, a Hindu person, an actual Thai Buddhist living in Bangkok in 2010. That is, as a person of faith, he is trying not as artistically as a less parenthetical writer might, through not only his reason, but also his imagination, to look at a world as a Buddhist or a Jew might, rather than the Buddhist or the Jew. Several of the readings that we did in the Buddhist and Christian Encounters course that Frank referred to, that I taught last semester, reflect Wilfred's emphasis on the religious person. One example is Kosuke Koyama's Water Buffalo Theology, a personal theological reflection first published in 1974 and then reissued in 1999. Koyama confesses that after 3 years as a missionary in Chiang Mai, his interest shifted from Buddhism to Buddhist people. A discovery that what really matters is not a set of doctrines called Buddhism, but people who are trying to live according to the Buddha's teachings. Buddhism does not and cannot engage in dialogue, says Koyama, with Christianity. Buddhists can. Christianity neither eats nor sleeps. Christians do. Buddhism doesn't sweat under the hot sun or hot Bangkok sun. Buddhists do. Islam does not recite the Quran. Muslims do. The reality of these traditions lies in living persons. From a person-centered perspective, Towards a World Theology is at one and the same time Smith's own particular theology. That is, an expression of his faith or I-thou posture toward the world. But embryonically, at least, it's a theology of religion, which is simultaneously particularistic and universal. A Buddhist or a Muslim might indeed quibble with his understanding and interpretation of his or her tradition, but these disagreements will be no more nor less than disagreements that might arise among those who stand within one historic religious community. And as would be true in that case, these disagreements will be fruitful and insightful if illuminated by faith in Smith's sense, not mere intellectual confrontation. While Smith's interpretation of a notion like transcendence might sound too Christian or theistic for a Theravada Buddhist, for example, interreligious encounter in Smith's sense would welcome such disagreement, for without it, the dialectic between the particular and the generic might be obfuscated or even lost. Some, indeed perhaps many, might be uncomfortable with Smith's approach, in part because his style can be that of a crotchety moralist, labeling the use of objective knowledge in humane sciences as immoral. An anecdote illustrates this observation. At the first of the comparative religious ethics conferences held here at the CSWR that eventually led to the creation of the Journal of Religious Ethics, David Little remembers with wry humor the following encounter with W.C. Smith. As I recall, says David, Wilfred and Bob Bella were seated next to each other not far from me, each visibly troubled in response to the discussion of the Twist Little book on comparative religious ethics taking place at that time. Wilfred rose from his seat, looked directly at me, face squinched up in anger, and delivered a furious denunciation of the approach that Barney and I took to that book, set off by his fabled wagging finger. I've forgotten the details of the attack, but the drift, as I dimly remember, was that our book represented an enormous setback in the comparative study of religious ethics. I'm sorry I never studied with Wilfred. Bringing to it the unwelcome Western analytic techniques whose only effect is to distort severely the materials under consideration. Beyond his sometimes crotchety moralism, however, Smith's approach to religion and religious studies may provoke discomfort because, while historical and inductive, it also embraces paradox and celebrates the elusiveness of what it means to be authentically human. From this perspective, I'm tempted to say that the value of Towards a World theology lies less in its theology, of which it has very little in any conventional sense, but the challenge that it offers to the way we as students and teachers approach religious studies. What would it mean to teach religion faithfully in Smith's sense? In the first instance, it would mean that courses in a particular religious tradition or aspect of that tradition should take into account its cumulative nature. The way Smith goes on to describe it, I think that's an impossible task, but let me go on. To be sure, one course in religion or particular religious tradition must set reasonable limits on what it can cover and accomplish. Regardless of its focus, however, any single course that doesn't reflect the richness and the diversity constituting its broader context runs the risk of reductionism and distortion. The New Testament, for example, should certainly be studied from the historical, literary, critical perspective, but as Smith argues, it should also be understood as sacred scripture that has influenced lives and shaped perceptions through a 2,000-year history. From this perspective, we could argue that a New Testament course in historical or literary criticism might be important in the development of exegetical skills, but that it fails as a study of sacred scripture in the sense suggested by Smith, namely, the nature and role of the New Testament as a sacred scripture in the lives of Christians and Christian communities. In this sense, I would propose that for Smith, Bible is to scripture as belief is to faith. A Smithian holistic approach to the study and teaching of religion calls for a cognizance of the relationship of a particular subject matter to the total life of a religious community in its historical and contemporaneous dimensions. That may be as impossible as transcendence. Within the context of a world theology, furthermore, a particular course dealing with theology, scripture, sacraments, ethics, and so on, would also have a generic dimension built into it. For example, the New Testament course, which has as a part of its structure and exploration of the transformative power of Scripture within the lives of individuals and communities, could explore this perspective in terms of the Bhagavad Gita in relationship to Hinduism, or the Quran in relationship to Islam. Opines Smith, the Quran is significant not primarily for what historically went into it, but because of what historically came out of it. The attempt to understand the Quran is to understand how it has fired the imagination, inspired the poetry, formulated the inhibitions, guided the ecstasies, teased the intellects, ordered family relations and legal chicaneries, and nurtured the piety of hundreds of millions of people in widely divergent centuries. Smith's position has profound implications not only for the substance, or should I say scope, of what we teach, but for the way in which we go about teaching it. Teaching religion, contends Wilfred, requires interpretation, imagination, insight, perceptuity, human sympathy, humility. Sounds like we need to be all bodhisattvas to me. It should not be engaged as an exercise in conveying a series of facts duly observed and recorded, or simply the logic of belief devoid of poetry and paradox. As I said earlier, I think the role of imagination in Smith's writing has been undervalued, despite the frequent occurrence of the term in many of his books and articles. Now let me be even more performative in illustrating this by sharing with you a couple of poems. To illustrate this point, I think Wilfred would have added an amen to one of my favorite Thomas Merton poems, The Fall. There is nowhere in you a paradise that is no place, and there you do not enter except without a story. To enter there is to become unnameable. Whoever is there is homeless, for he has no door and no identity with which to go out and to come in. Whoever is nowhere is nobody, and therefore cannot exist except as unborn. No disguise will avail him anything. Such a one is neither lost nor found, but he who has an address is lost. They fall into apartments and are severely established. They find themselves in streets. They're licensed to proceed from place to place. They now know their own names. They can name several friends and know their telephones must ring sometime. If all telephones ring at once, if all names are shouted at once and all cars crash at one crossing, if all cities explode and fly away in dust, yet identities refuse to be lost. There's a name and a number for everyone. There's a definite place for bodies. There are pigeonholes for ashes. Such security can business buy. Who would dare to go nameless in so secure a universe? Yet, to tell the truth, only the nameless are at home in it. They bear with them in the center of nowhere the unborn flower of nothing. This is the paradise tree. It must remain unseen until words end and arguments are silent. I can't now recall the occasion that prompted me to give Michael Jackson a copy of Merton's poem, but in response, Michael retaliated with a copy of one of his own poems, Postcard from Somerville, with the sticky note, another view from nowhere of the unnameable. I'm quite sure that Wilfred would see the two poems taken together as capturing a more complete expression of his theological worldview than Merton's poem, The Fall, taken by itself. Postcard from Somerville. I'm sitting in the biscuit on Beacon Street. The sun is hot. I will not read it as well as you, Michael, but let me attempt. I'm sitting in the biscuit on Beacon Street. The sun is hot for late September. The cassette player playing sad Brazilian songs, and the proprietor and his wife are far from home. A middle-aged man takes his empty coffee cup back to the counter, strokes his belly, and says, "I feel much better," to no one in particular. In a photo on the wall, two barefoot kids are eating ice cream. I'm also far from here, in a place resembling this, yet nothing like it. The smell of open drains, orange peel, and ash is Africa. The music, South America. Ice cream, a beach in the antipodes. Yet where I am is a place I have not been, where the coffee tastes so good you share the experience with a stranger, though no one is really a stranger there, and the music works for everyone, goes by any name, labels erased, ID cards burned like feminist bras, pass cards under apartheid, or the draft cards of conscripts refusing an unjust war. I wish I was there. The moral dimension of imagination finds expression in empathic understanding and sympathy. Terminology used by Smith and embodied in the deed of the gift that initially founded the CSWR. Empathy is a sense of cognitive, affective unity with the other, resonating with David Hume's extensive benevolence that grows from an apprehension of the human race as one family. Or in Smithian terminology, world religion rather than world religions. Smith's vision resonates with the broader reaches, I think, of Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community. Is it too fanciful, Smith asks, to hold that our one-worldedness is bringing all humanity together in such a way that every one of us is being caught up in the processes of all? It is his deep moral sense, I believe, that undergirds and inspires Smith as constructive critic and a visionary, not only of religious studies as a discipline and the academy, but of culture. And let me close with some particular extractions in regard to Smith, I think, as a social critic, as a moralist, a person very concerned about issues of social justice. Human development has reached a point where we must construct some kind of world order, or we perish. And this world order must have intellectual and moral dimensions as well as economic and political. Some of you will perhaps say that surely we can get on with the business of political structures, of economic planning, of technical advance, of strategic defense, without raising extraneous issues of religious faith or cultural convictions, issues that may be interesting in themselves but are irrelevant to secular concerns. This division of life into two spheres, the religious and the secular, is characteristically Western. We tend to assume that everyone will share it. and that the problem of building a new world order is that of imposing Western civilization on the world. Fortunately, there has been some recognition, though belated and partial, that the 19th century solution of Western domination by force must be abandoned, and along with it, the arrogance of cultural superiority. The new world that is waiting to be born is a world of cultural pluralism, of diverse faith. Let no one imagine that building the new world community will be easy. Is this possible? I don't know. But it's the fundamental challenge facing humanity today. My own faith is that it can be achieved, but whether we shall rise to it or not remains to be seen. The movement, pioneering, historically crucial, with vast new issues at stake involving the highest ideals of humankind through history on the one hand, and the more realistic and practical international problems on the other, all this is stirring. Those who are reaching for the stars these days in a literal sense are launched on an exciting endeavor, but a metaphorical reaching for the stars that is involved in the quest for a world community is even more exciting, significant, and rewarding. I had not well-timed my talk, but I would like to take a few minutes at the end to reflect on what I said about Wilfred in regard to the center. And I really want to make 4 points. The center is one of the most contemplative physical spaces, not only at HDS, but I think by the testimony of people who walk into the courtyard, the university. We haven't talked about contemplation in the panel today, but it certainly is an important part of insight and understanding ourselves as person, the complexities of the life in which we live, in a way that hopefully is a good complement to all that we pour into our minds and all that we think about analytically. Not only the sort of poetic truth, but if you will, contemplative understanding. We added a Zen garden to the lovely courtyard. Unfortunately, the picture was taken before I got out my Zen rake and raked the... So those of you who know about Zen gardens will wonder, well, you know, where are the rivulets? Sorry about that. But part of the contemplation. It's more than what meets the eye. When Larry Sullivan was directing the center in honor of his 13 years, Dimitri Altinos, I'm not sure I pronounced the name right, Larry, but an artist and a national treasure of Greece, honored Larry's 13 years by this garden, what we call the Garden of the Gods. Trenches lined with silver, casting white light, reflecting the sun in the shape of the initial letters of the names of the deities, significant to the fellows then living at the center. The designs fill, these are Larry's words from the history that John Carman and Kit Dodson put together. If you haven't bought it, you should buy it. The fellows and families living at the center move slowly from one divine character to the other, placing offerings, souvenirs, and memorials in pairs of earthenware bowls. The two sons of Sandy Big Tree, a Mohawk woman, and her husband, Phil Arnold, from Syracuse University, offer a Mohawk basket woven by their great aunt, and the family sprinkles tobacco leaves, as does David Carrasco. The days are full of reflections and recollections, musing and amusements. Everyone is curious, trading questions. Altinos, Merlin-like, enhance the present moment and its participants by casting them under the spell of other dimensions of time. They travel in their imaginations to a far-off future when those traces of their lives may be unearthed, and backward in time, imagining that the fruits of the day's actions will one day be recovered by a future that will treat the present day as a moment in its far-flung past. As the design and the objects disappear into the ground, they also sink into the imaginations of all present to begin their life as images that will surface in dreams and ripple through time in the form of memories and reflections. Is this a reach toward transcendence? perhaps. Another reach toward transcendence. Losang doing the Wheel of Becoming mandala in the common room of the center, my second year there. And we will be able to participate in another mandala act shortly, very, very soon. Is this merely symbolic? What kind of transcendence does this point to? This is not a transcendent mandala. But mandalas are, after all about connections. Vertical as well as horizontal. Presumably these are more horizontal direct connections than they are vertical. But from the very beginning, I've seen the center as indeed part of a web, part of a mandalic web, the center that reaches out and brings people in, back and forth, this sort of pulsating, interactive energy that I think characterizes or should characterize the center in relationship to HDS, in relationship to the university, in relationship to the world beyond us. So, and indeed the natural world. I mean, our focus has been very much on human communities and interacting with institutes and what have you. But particularly today, very much the way in which we interact with and relate to the natural environment, what I refer to as ecologies of human flourishing, is an extremely important part of where we are today in the 21st century and what we do. What takes place in this space? Well, so much emphasis upon persons. The luncheon yesterday, the testimony of the panelists, Smith's personalism, it's all about persons. So what do we come to comprehend and understand regarding religious diversity, persons, and community in the CSWR? Deborah Haynes, who was at the center in 94-95, an art historian at the University of Colorado. I held a senior fellowship at the CSWR in 94-95, during which I completed my second book, The Vocation of the Artist. That year, the diverse groups of scholars in several disciplines created a supportive and intellectually stimulating context. One of my neighbors was the Israeli historian Emmanuel Etkes. We had numerous illuminating conversations about the history and present conflict in the Middle East, but more significant was what I learned from him and another Orthodox Jewish family about the power of the Sabbath. In the scurry of contemporary life, how do we find time for contemplation, visit with friends, and shared meals? When do we learn about what community actually means? My unique experience with these Jewish colleagues reshaped my daily life as I began to take Saturdays as a day away from my work. And just down the balcony were Duncan Williams and Barbara Ambrose, two Zen priests with whom I practiced Zazen during the year in the small zendo they created in their apartment. Those hours of sitting and walking with Duncan and Barbara deeply influenced my desire to establish a personal meditation practice. Edith Turner, Anthropology, University of Virginia. The Center of the Study of World Religions proved a haven for one who was striving to free anthropology from, by the way, the reference to the anthropologist who believes in spirits. Here we have Edith. Striving to free anthropology from the taboo within her discipline against showing herself as practicing and experienced religion or any idea that one's field interlocutors in other religions were right, that spirits do in fact exist. Not only did the CSWR provide a haven for me, but its program included real Buddhist, Hindu, and Jewish rituals performed on the premise in which we could join. As a research into ritual and its on-the-pulse effects, and above all, into the origin of its sacred power, I was free to give papers on the anthropology of experience, how a person with faculties not limited to those concerned with scientific psychology and measurement actually experiences the rituals of hearing and the presence of the Spirit. So this week we had a faculty luncheon, which has grown from the first couple of years to 8 or 10 faculty members to now between 20 and 30. So on April the 12th, there was a faculty lunch led by Amy Hollywood. There were 26 faculty members there. Among that group, there were 11 recipients of CSWR faculty grants. And the discussion was focused on her course with poetry, particularly difficult poets, in which such notions as interactive poetics, opening up spaces for multiple readings, the evocative and the provocative, if you will, going back to my use of the term imagination in regard to Wilfred Cantwell Smith. They were all very attentive, I think, weren't they? It's, So, part of, again, I think Wilfred's emphasis upon the person is who is the human and rethinking the human. So we, again, part of our thematic programming and conference was on this theme. This book has chapters from medical anthropologists, Charlie Hallisey. I could go on, but I don't have the time. And finally, my last point and concluding point about the center is a pitch for Frank. I could do this now because he had to leave to catch a plane to go to a meeting. Indeed, it is a center for the study of world religions. It's also for the comparative study of world religions. And Frank brings, of course, a commitment to that enterprise and a deep background in it. He is a leader in the field of comparative theology from 1998 to 2004. He was the first president of the Society for Hindu Christian Studies. And I just want to close then with a quote from that book. The context for today's comparative theology is growing religious diversity. Diversity in and among religions is not novel, but its impact has intensified in recent decades as a pronounced and defining phenomenon that is global but still impacts us in the particular places where we live. Our time and place, therefore, urge upon us a necessary interreligious learning. Diversity becomes a primary context for a tradition's inquiry and self-understanding. Particular traditions in their concreteness become the place where religious meaning of diversity is disclosed. But such learning, intelligently evaluated and extended, by such learning, intelligently evaluated and extended, we make deeper sense of ourselves intellectually and spiritually in the light of what we find in the work around us. Thank you very much.